My name is Lawrence Duff, and I was born in Calgary in 1924. In 1942, in December, I had my 18th birthday, so I knew there'd be a call for service very shortly. And indeed, early in 43, I got the letters saying to be ready for an Army call-up, or I could go to the Navy or Air Force recruiting. When I got to the Air Force recruiting office, which was in the top floor of the Hudson's Bay building, they informed me that if I wished to enlist in aircrew, that would take 18 to 24 months minimum training before you got into field work, which probably preclude going to Europe. You'd be probably going to Asia. Well, I had lots of ideas about going to see relatives in Europe, so I said, what about photographers? I have a lot of experience in photography. And they said, oh yes, photography is a big craft in the Air Force. And so I arranged to take a trade test with the photographic officer the following week. A letter came one day from the Air Force announcing the date that I was to appear at the CBR station and go to Edmonton, picked up my truck and went to Edmonton Manning Pool, where there were thousands of people recently enlisted. First order of the day was to find out about everything Air Force, and that took about 3 weeks of basic training. During that time, you had an identification number and photograph taken, and that was done in a photographic department. Well, here's photography. So once we were in dispersal, where we had to probably do all kinds of work in the kitchen, unloading trucks and so on, I thought I might just go up and see if the photographic section could use me, and indeed I was hired on. I had a posting to Edmonton AOS, and that was a very interesting station in the Air Force because AOS's was Air Observer Training Schools, and they were privately owned and had some kind of a financial agreement with the Air Force. That station happened to be 2 or 3 of the old bush pilots from the north, which was pretty important because they were doing their flying training in northern Alberta, and those people knew a lot about the ground conditions. However, as a photographer, I appeared on the station late one afternoon, and the following morning came in, and the corporal asked if I was a good photographer and could do commercial work. And I said yes, I could. And he said, well, can you operate a speed graphic camera? And I said, I've never had one in my hand, but I know all about them, and yes, I can operate it. Well, he said, well, you have to go out on a job, and it's a very important job. So load up the film, get the camera, and indeed overnight, a factory down by the river in Edmonton produced wooden aircraft and fabric aircraft wings for light aircraft, and it had burned down overnight. It was quite a challenge for a photographer because there were no light and everything was charred black. But I got some excellent pictures from some of the experience I'd had before, and that made me the golden-haired boy in Edmonton AOS. Ottawa was a great experience because there were 1 or 2 of us that were competent photographers, and probably 20 others who knew very little about it. And we became assistant teachers to the teaching crew, who were mostly Kodak technical reps, who we've all dealt with over the years previously. It was a great time to be in Ottawa. It was a beautiful spring. It was lying out on the sand at Hog's Back and going roller skating in Hull and going out to Luna Park to ride the roller coasters. Part of the fun in Ottawa was the fact that the course, I think ours was 138, we had maybe 14 Newfoundland WAFs, Women Air Force, who had elected to learn to be photographers. And they knew absolutely nothing about photography, and there was no way that the 4 teachers from Kodak could get them to be photographers in 3 months. So another competent photographer and I, Barney Bjornson, who had a studio in Flin Flon, we elected to help the kids, and we did our week's work always on Friday morning. But in the meantime, we were trying to teach these people about optics and chemistry and lighting, all the complexity we'd learned over a number of years. And they were great. They were great, and they tried their hardest. It was just so completely foreign to them, but it was a wonderful opportunity for them to get out of Newfoundland, see the world, and learn a trade that they probably would never have a chance to do in Newfoundland. When I was in Ottawa at the photo school, there was an interesting 3 weeks in which we learned about the aerial camera and its operation, and had a chance to use it. In taking a line overlap, which essentially was what was taken overseas on bombing raids, we had to lie on our stomach in the nose of an Anson. The pilot couldn't see the ground feature, and we had to advise him go left or right according to lifting our legs in the direction of flight. Of course, the pilot was trained to go off the ground feature line so that you could see the correction in flight and see that the photographer had responded adequately. After the line overlap sequence, we went other times and took pictures with the camera in a handheld mount at a 45 degree, which they call obliques, or whatever the degree was, of a feature, like a tall building at a corner, or something that theoretically would be of some interest, a feature on the ground, but not from overhead. Shortly after graduation in Ottawa, I got a posting to Prince Edward Island, to the Bombing and Gunnery School at Mount Pleasant. That was a very interesting trip to me because I'd never been east of Montreal, and now I was going through the Maritimes and across on the ferry to the island, and up island to Bombing and Gunnery School. The purpose of the whole school was to train air gunners, and the target for the air gunners was a large cloth sack pulled behind a Cessna, and the air gunner in another aircraft aimed his gun, but it was not loaded with bullets, it was loaded with camera film on a camera attached to the gun barrel, a 16mm movie camera that accurately recorded where his sights were aimed on the drogue. The small 16mm cameras had the film in cassettes. The purpose of the photographic department was to take the film out of the cassettes, process it, and prepare it for the evaluators, and reload the cassettes with 16mm film. And there was a very large crew there because when they flew, they used a lot of film, and there was a lot of processing, but they didn't fly very often. PEI was not a very good place for a training school. The first thing in the morning, one of the photographic section went up with a test pilot, and that pilot ran around the areas that they would be flying over with the drogue, and the photographer would say, well, there isn't enough contrast to make a good record, so we can't fly today. And that ended the exercise for that day. On station, I met quite a knowledgeable editorial typewriter, and he ran a little station newspaper. And he found out of my experience, and he said, how would you like to help me on some little off-station activities that would be good in our newspaper? I know there's a search and rescue station up at Tignish. Well, I wanted to go to Tignish because I'd heard that the French Canadians there could not be understood by the French Canadians from Montreal. So indeed we did go up to Tignish, which is at the northern tip of the island, and met the boat and the crew, and heard about some of their exploits pulling airplanes and pilots out of the water, and it made an interesting feature article in the station paper. Anything to get off the station, I volunteered to take pictures for the Highways Department on behalf of the Air Force of the damage caused by Air Force trucks running over the lightly made PEI roads. And they were developing cracks and breaks and so on, and the government was trying to get the federal government to do the repairs. So I had an exciting day or two going to Highway 1, mile 42, horizontal, north to south cracks, and then onto mile 47, vertical cracks, 8 feet long, 3 feet from the shoulder of the road. And what an exciting day that was. But at least I wasn't filling up those camera and magazines with film or doing the automatic processing. After the posting came to PEI, I got a great treat, and that was a long ride back to Calgary. Everybody had an embarkation leave, so you could go back home and see your family and so on, theoretically, perhaps for the last time. And they gave you 2 weeks, and that was a great holiday. Part of the holiday was the wonderful trip on the train for 6 days. It really gave you a view of the length of Canada and capacity of the country and the vastness. We returned to Truro because everybody couldn't be in Halifax, and they called you from Truro a day or two before the ship was ready. And we got on the boat in Halifax, and this trip was about a week, I think. The boat was very crowded, but we did get 3 meals a day. There were lots of, Crown and Anchor was a game that was played, watching for ships, we never saw any. Watching for submarines, we never saw any. So the time hung heavy on your hands, except for the gamblers who were playing poker or Crown and Anchor or dice and so on, and quite a bit of money changed hands. At any rate, eventually we arrived in Southampton, and the idea was to get you out of the area, and evening we were in the town of Cheshire. Now we're leaving Cheshire to a posting to a photographic establishment, and that was Leaming, Yorkshire. And that was quite a distance by train, and we arrived in a very well organized, big permanent force RAF station with nice buildings, nice mess halls, all kinds of facilities. And there we got issued a few extra different pieces of clothing and so on, like a gas mask, etc., that we didn't bring over from Canada with us. In a few days, they announced they needed volunteers to go to a dispersed camp at Skipton-on-Swale. And Josh Siegel and I, and there were other bomb armors and other trades, we all put our hands up. Let's get going, because we were doing nothing in Leaming. So we moved by truck and brought extra bunk beds and so on, and ended up outside some little Nissen huts up on a slight hill, Skipton-on-Swale. A dispersed camp, dispersed for security, so that bombers couldn't really have pinpointed from pre-war activity all of these camps all over the Yorkshire moor. Most important was to get to the bike shop, because you needed a bike to go distances from that you were always encountering. Siegel got the last bike. Well, that was a little bit of a blow, but I looked around. In the corner there was a girl's WAF bike, and I said, I'll take that. And the guy said, no, that's a girl's bike. I said, no, I'm going to convert it. So we went over to the airframe shop and got an 18-inch piece of tubing, and so I had a bike seat that sat far up above the bike frame, but it worked fine. It had to work fine because we were expected to carry 4 of those magazines, which probably weighed over 5 pounds each, on the handlebars going around servicing. And it was even a little bit heavier than that bike, because when Mort Vaslov came a few days later, there were no bikes repaired yet. So he used to service aircraft going on the handlebars of my bike, and we had the 4 magazines. It was good fun. Skipton Camp was a very interesting place. We had no one told you anything about it, and of course everything was secret because it was the war. The war was on, and there were no signs, there were no lights at night. There were no paths to different buildings and so on. It was a very secretive kind of place with hundreds of guys moving in all directions. The basic airfield, was 3 triangular runways with a perimeter road around the runways. On the outside of the perimeter road were a series of Nissen huts, which were service facility. The photo shack probably was 3/4 of a mile or more away from headquarters, and at the headquarters facility it wasn't, there were a couple or three buildings there. That was the headquarters photo, and there was a building for aircraft rec, and I think the parachute section was next door. Far away in another direction was the mess hall. And up near the Nissen huts where we lived was a Nissen hut that was the medical facility. But it all took miles and miles, and you could not operate without a bicycle. Down on, I think it was the west side of the camp, was a little trickle of water, which was the Swale. And that's the name, Skipton on Swale. This was this little dispersed camp sitting out on the Yorkshire moors, trying to fly aircraft every day, every night over Europe. Early in the afternoon, a call would come over the public address tannoy system saying that a knock was planned for that evening. As the day wore on, we got notice into the section how many planes were going from each squadron. Later, we learned what height the planes were flying, what the weather conditions were. Then decisions were made about how the camera would be set to best take pictures under those conditions. Once we had that information, the photo bashers, as we were called, grabbed the magazines and went to the individual aircraft, put the magazine on the aircraft, went up the front, set the photo switches, the toggle switches on the bomb aimer's panel, did one exposure, ran back to make sure that it had exposed, ran forward to activate the system because you did it under a test condition so that you didn't drop the bombs, and then back out and out of the aircraft as quickly as you could onto the next aircraft. So there were probably 4 or 6 in the team fitting the aircraft. You had theoretically adequate time. You had all the time in the world, in theory. The truth of the matter was, intelligence might change some of the conditions as they learned about weather, anti-aircraft, and indeed they often changed the destination. So of course the flying conditions would be different, and then went back to the photo shack because you had all these empty magazine cases that on the handlebars of your bike. Your responsibilities were over until those aircraft returned. A crew was on, as long as there were aircraft in the air, there was a crew in the photo shack until they returned. The return was someplace between 4 and 8 hours. That's why the bunks were there. You might be sleeping till 2 in the morning and suddenly there was a roar of bomber engines and you knew that the planes were returning, and of course they all returned to their own slot off the perimeter road, and you went to retrieve the magazines in the dark with no lights, no flashlights. The interior aircraft lights were still on, and it didn't take much to take the magazine off the camera and put a protection plate over the glass and get out and get those magazines over for processing at squadron headquarters. So all the magazines went back to the squadron office. Another person took them on the bike handlebars over to squadron where they were processed and reloaded, and the following day picked up and put back on the shelves. On the bike from the mess hall around the perimeter track to the Nissen hut with the little sign on the door, a squadron photo. 424 and 433. I don't know where 433 had been domiciled before, but 424 and many of these guys had been over in North Africa chasing Rommel. Anyway, the squadron photo was a part of maybe half of a Nissen hut, and it was our home. There you could live graciously. We had a toaster and a teapot and a coffee pot and spare tea and lots of coffee. I'll explain that later. And locally in that part of the country, they made some marvelous malt bread. And toasted malt bread didn't require any margarine or butter on it. And coffee, and that became our meals, augmented by things from Canada. The most common and desirable thing was Lipton noodle soup. You could make it in a minute in the saucepan. And the second most desirable thing was Mrs. Siegel's salami chubs or Jewish cookies. And Siegel insisted on sharing them with all of us. So, but everything was cramped. But everybody knew about cramp. We were cramped everywhere except out there on the field, and you learned to get along very well. The key to it was when we were busy, there was nobody in the shack, you were all out in the field. And when we weren't busy, most of the, one or two fellows would stay in the shack ready for any emergency, and the rest of us would do our regular things of life. And Siegel and I often went out and took scenic photos, sometimes did laundry, got the bike tire patched, and all the domestic things like that. Squadron photo was a new family life, and you'll see in the picture my great buddies that we remained in contact 40 years after the war. This is the F-24 camera that I was intimately connected with in bombing in England. The camera was a series of components. Here's the lens in the front. We never changed the focal lengths of different lenses to get different effects. We had a formula, and that seemed to be the formula that the interpreters liked. It was an 8-inch focal length lens, which means the center of the lens here to where the film was here was 8 inches. And that produced certain elements of scale which allowed easy interpretation by the people who read the prints. The film was pressed tightly against this glass surface during exposure so that it was perfectly flat, and during the exposure by the focal plane shutter. Focal plane shutter was this element within the body here, which actually consisted of a gearbox and a shutter blind that ran here. This mechanism is all within here and connected to the driving mechanism here, which is a 12 or 24 volt motor. And in the case of a handheld, there was a winder on it, but they were usually removed because no one in bombing use had any access to the camera. It was down in a deep well. The camera was driven by this motor, controlled by wires to here, here, and to this box. The F-24 camera body was the heart of the whole system. It was a simple cast aluminum box that allowed additional pieces to be attached to it. Perhaps the most important piece fit on the side here and control the blind that came back and forth to make the exposure. The heart of the F-24 camera was the gearbox and shutter mechanism that was inserted in the side of the camera body. It was a very sophisticated piece of equipment and had quite a number of variations. The most important part of it was the focal plane shutter, which was a piece of black rubberized cloth that moved across from one spindle to the other, determining the amount of the exposure. But it was driven by the gearbox. The gearbox did many things, and in the bombing field, it was always driven by a 24 or 12 volt motor, depending on the type of aircraft. The gearbox was so complicated and so condensed because it had so many functions. It moved the film, it responded to the control mechanisms, it cocked the shutter, it adjusted the speed of the shutter, and it had to work or you didn't get a picture. The gearbox mechanism probably was the cause of most camera failures. The other problem that occurred was either with somehow the shutter mechanism collapsing, because these planes were operating under high speed, high vibration, high altitude use, and the difficulty of transporting the film from spindle to spindle in the magazine under sometimes very cold conditions. The magazine was a piece of equipment that moved around a lot and was carried in the canvas bags, thrown, hung on bicycle handlebars, transported around in the around from aircraft to aircraft, from squadron to headquarters. It consisted of a thin metal case. On the bottom was an opening that fit over top of the glass plate on the top of the camera. Inside was a film spool mechanism consisting of a feed roller and a receive roller of film. Behind it was a felt covered pressure plate that raised up while the film was moving and came down tight, so the film was pressed tightly against the glass during exposure. The film was transported by these two rollers, and the drive roller at one time was a rubber sleeve over steel. Found that didn't work, and they had already replaced that with some little sharp pins that were on that roller, but that tore the film at high temperatures, or high altitudes and low temperatures. So the final solution was the rubber sleeves on the drives and a heating muff over the top of the camera to keep the parts warm, so that they could be easily moved in the cold upper atmosphere. So the film went into the magazine, was sealed up, and was one of the most important parts of the camera operation. This is the K24 camera set in a handheld mount with clamps here and a release here. The camera was held on the photographer's lap until you got near destination, at which time you lifted it up and put it on the door of the aircraft with the window removed. You had a long discussion with the pilot about positioning for the subject matter, and as the pilot got the aircraft in position, the photographer got the subject matter into the frame, exposed it with this release, and then could add it, but had to have it off the side of the plane to minimize vibration. You could put it back on the side of the plane, tip the camera over, wind the shutter so that it was ready for the next exposure, and the pilot meanwhile is navigating the plane around the subject matter so that a shot can be taken at a different point, from a different point of view. Once again, the photographer releases the shutter and the second exposure is made. Often it would be 4 exposures on a given thing, but depending on light and shade, clouds, etc. The film is delivered to the processing station at Squadron in a magazine with a lot of information on the back of it. In the first darkroom, the magazine is taken apart, the film taken out, and that information transferred onto the tab of the film. Then the film is transported to the wet darkroom, to the stainless steel developing tank, which consists of handles, 2 drums, and ports for liquid to enter and exit. Film is taken across to one drum and secured at one end. The drum is rolled and the other end secured. The result is you have a piece of film going from drum to drum, and you rotate it once or twice to make sure it's moving perfectly. Put the lid on. Now we can turn on the light and start the developing process, which consists of a water wash to dissolve to soften the emulsion of the film, a developing bath, which is poured in and removed from here, then a water bath to remove the alkaline developer, and then the acid fixing bath, which is poured in and the film rotated for about 5 minutes, at which time the lid can come off and the film can be inspected. If all is well, cold water is run in the tank and the film removed and put on a rotating drum dryer, which takes about 15 minutes.
1 minute 43.
The big developing tank was usually in a sink, and in Skipton we had a sink that was about 6 feet long by 2.5 feet wide with duckboards in it, so that 1, 2, or 3 tanks could be used by teams if there was a large amount of work. When the station was shut down for weather or other kinds of technical problems, photographers could use the darkroom and the chemistry. You couldn't use the paper because it was all carefully copyrighted on the back by the Defense Department. But we could process film, and however, you had to get permission. You could never get permission to do it on Tuesday evenings, but after being there for a while, I learned that Tuesday evenings was the night that Bill Goodland, the corporal, took the duckboards out, scrubbed the big sink clean, and that became his bathtub. Quite a plus for the corporal. The rest of us had to have a shower over in a Nissen hut with a few shower heads and a storm of ice cold rain dripping off the Nissen hut ribs. Contact printing took place after the rolls of dry film were ready to be printed on photographic paper. Paper was 5 by 5, marked with the government's crest on the back so you couldn't steal it, and they were exposed on a light box by a printer, and he had to be somebody who could really well assess a negative for exposure. The best ones were the ones who had worked in high quality photo finishing plants, because they'd been doing the best for the bad amateur negatives they'd received for years. Coupled with him was the guy standing beside the developer tray, the super, and he could recover overexposed prints, and he could extend development on underexposed ones, which saved a lot of redoing. These fellows worked usually in teams, and there might be 2 teams producing the day's material. Their handling ended when they got the prints into the stop bath, where they were gathered in groups of 10 and subsequently put into the fixture and the washer and onto the dryer by just regular fellows who were photographers, who we all termed water buffaloes. And it was a very important part of the thing because speed was of the essence. When those prints got off the dryer, you had 200 prints and all kinds of classifications, and you were gathering them together into the right sequence for packaging and shipping to interpretation over in the intelligence department in Leaning. The F-24 camera was set so that there was a 2/3 film image overlap of the print before and following. This 2/3 overlap allowed the prints to be examined with a stereopticon viewer so that depth perception was possible. That allowed them to determine the height of standing buildings, the depth of craters, the height of rubble, and that was the point of the whole thing, because it meant whether they were going to have to go back and redo that raid on another night. There were a great bunch of guys in photo section, and it was very lighthearted and lots of jokes. one of the oft-told stories by the people of 424 Squadron who'd been in North Africa was of one of our members, Dick Gordon. Dick Gordon was a very competent photographer and a great technician and mechanic, although a little bit like a absent-minded professor, because his mind was always on some other subject and you had to catch his attention. But when they were in North Africa, they soon learned that Dick had grown up in the south of France. His father had been an English tennis teacher and his French was impeccable. And food rations weren't very good in Africa. And one day Dick wandered off across the sands and returned with his tin hat off, and in it 2 or 3 eggs. Well, no one had seen an egg for a few years. And they gathered around and Dick took the eggs out, cleaned the inside of his tin hat up, started whipping the eggs up together, and then carefully massaged his head and forehead where his thinning blonde hair was fading away a little bit, and he had a nice egg shampoo to maintain his beautiful looks. The guys who hadn't seen an egg for 2 or 3 years were ready to scalp him. We knew the war was coming to an end in May 45 because there was a stand down and nothing was flying and nobody was doing anything, but nothing was being announced until that specific day. The announcement came over the tannoy that it was a holiday and the war was over, so I immediately got ready to travel to Leeds by train and walked around Leeds watching the activities. People were celebrating in fountains and climbing monuments and hanging flags, but nothing that had anything to do with me, and I didn't see one person I knew. I thought there might be a possibility by going over to a famous, massive pub that everyone in the services knew in Leeds, and the main activity there was singing a local Yorkshire song with the Yorkshire lassies from the mills on Ilkley Moor Bar Tat. But I didn't know any verses, and after walking around, I didn't even want to have a drink of beer. So I walked out of the place, walked around the streets a little bit further, then went back on the train to Skipton, thinking, I wonder how soon I'm going to be back in Calgary. Will it be Christmas or before? As we waited around after the war, we wondered what was going to happen to us. We soon learned that there was a system of repatriation based on numbers, which is years of service and whether you're married, children, and so on. Well, of course, I wasn't really in the repatriation crowd because I'd only been there a year, and others had been there 5 years, and I was a single guy, not yet 21. So one day we got notice that we were being shipped to Germany, go to the south of England and over by boat to Holland, Belgium, and into Germany, and we ended up in a large camp north of Hamburg at a next German Luftwaffe camp. And there were hundreds of guys arriving on the trains and being carried to this camp. We didn't know what was going on or what we were going to start there, but it was obviously a very much a going concern. Well, what we didn't know was we were being groomed to be the Army of Occupation. And indeed, they had done a survey, perhaps after I got there, although I wasn't in it, in which they surveyed some servicemen, and these servicemen voted overwhelmingly to stay as Army of Occupation. When it was later analyzed, it was mostly aircrew guys who had no reason to come home at all and were young, not unmarried, and having the time of their lives in very hospitable messes with lots of liquor and almost no flying. The people who didn't want to stay were the technicians, like photographers, who'd been around for a long time and who had wives and children. Because in Canada, the newspapers were telling people that some of the boys wouldn't be coming home soon because they had volunteered for service in the Army of Occupation. Of course, my friend Siegel, who had a wife and boy back home waiting for him, and he was about 30 by that time, he wasn't too happy, nor were any of the others. So, and we weren't much of an Army of Occupation. For instance, a photographer like myself had never taken any military armament training. You were trained to do Air Force style photography. They had the numbers of people, and they didn't really know what they wanted to do with this. We were there on the basis that there might be insurrection and uprising and riots for starving people, etc. None of those things happened in Hamburg that I know of, but and they tried to make it as pleasant as they could. We had lots of time off to go to Hamburg, lots of time off to do anything, but we were able to go on leave courses. And my friend Josh Siegel went on a leave course in December to Copenhagen, and there he bought presents for his wife and presents for my mother and returned. And then I went to Paris in January to a course at the Sorbonne, and it was great. We actually attended lectures in the horseshoe-shaped amphitheaters, and we were welcomed by students who were volunteers to take us around, and we had the opportunity, if we had money, which we did have, to buy perfume, Chanel No. 5, and other. They said, oh, not that old stuff. They had far better ones for us to buy, and that was all right. And indeed, there was more hospitality. I bought things for Siegel's wife, my mother, and my father had loved French literature, and so I bought a book, sight unseen, but recommended by one of these young ladies as the hottest item on the hit parade. And years later, I asked my father, and he said, I hated it. It was all about the war. On return from Paris, we had a connection in Brussels as we had on the way to Paris, and I had an opportunity to stay an extra day, which was wonderful. The British military had taken over the Hotel Metropole, and we could eat there, and we could get food vouchers, and there were a large number of British troops there, and there were signs about if you wanted to do activities. And I wanted to do activities and see the city, and there were some beautiful buildings in Brussels. So I put my name down, and I went to some nearby canteen, and there was a reception people, and they said, what would you like to do? And I'd like to go around and see some of the art galleries or places of interest or famous buildings. Well, yes. And so a very nice lady, local lady, perhaps about 38 or 40, big, healthy, strong Belgium, took me under her hand, and we walked around the city, and she pointed out many of these places to me, and was very hospitable. And I think we stopped someplace and had a cup of coffee and a biscuit, and delivered me back to home. And I was telling the people there how nice this lady, Claude, had been. And so knowledgeable, and so adept at knowing every building and its history and so on. And they said, oh, Claude? Oh, yes, that's the Countess Claude d'Ursel. I don't suppose she mentioned to you that she's a famous underground fighter and managed to kill 8 Germans during the occupation. Everybody in the Uderson camp was looking for something to do. You could go to Hamburg, you could go on leave, but you were really ready and willing to work because most of us had been working for the whole war. So when some guys were enlisted to go up to Peenemünde, which is on the Baltic coast where the buzz bombs were sent to downtown London every day for near the end of the war, these fellows went up there to demob the place or whatever was required. And they had a terrific time. Others noticed that these 6 or 8 guys seemed to be slightly intoxicated most of the time, but not falling down drunk or anything. And that carried on for a week, and all of them died. The secret, of course, was that the buzz bomb fuel was pure 100% ethanol. And they found some easily dispensed containers, and they were slugging back the ethanol while they're performing those duties, and apparently the death certificate said that they had died due to dehydration. The alcohol removed all the moisture from their body. There was a rotating roster of jobs, once again to keep people busy. And one day I drew the job of on guard duty at the security fence. Well, the security fence encircled a large pile of coal, which was pretty valuable. And there was a little guardhouse there with a few bunks, and we arrived, and I didn't know any of the other people that had got picked up on that roster, but they were all nice guys, and I asked around, do any of you guys know anything about rifles? No, they were just as uninformed as I was. So I said, you know, there's bullets in all these guns, and I don't want to get involved in any fooling around with these things that could be a little bit deadly. How about we take the bullets out of the guns and throw them up on the bunk there, and then the 2 guys who go out every 15 or 20 minutes to do a little tour around the coal, they'll take the rifles with no bullets, and there won't be anybody killed on site. And so they all agreed that that was a pretty good idea, and the evening guard duty went without incident. Just as running around England, I was interested in meeting people, seeing how businesses worked, how people lived. Well, my opportunity was to get on the truck and go down to Hamburg, centered myself at the All Ranks Club, and found out what to do and where to go. Went and walked around the 2 lovely lakes in the center of town, the Ulsters, walked down Kolonnadenstrasse, and learned about a very high-class black market that took place in front of a large hospital, Funkenhaus Park. Then went out there, and that was an opportunity to everyone wanted to talk to you, whether you had anything to sell or they were interested in communicating, because that was the new way to get along in Germany, was to know the enemy. It worked out well for me because early on I was able to buy quite an obscure, almost outdated camera, a Zeiss Miraflex. After I got it home, the photographers saw it, and Josh Siegel said, well, if you ever see a Pablo Machina, see if you can get it. I love a Pablo Machina. Well, most of us had never seen a Pablo Machina. The only place I'd ever seen them was in ads from Willoughby's, New York, or someplace like that, because they were a very exotic import camera and very high price. Perhaps in the 30s, they might have been $350, a lot of money. Anyway, I was able to help Josh Siegel out when he came back from Denmark. I told him I had a little surprise for him. And I had 2 Pablo Machinas, the beautifully brushed chrome finished one and the professional black and chrome. Well, but these little financial things were not a benefit. You got to know people, and you really, now where would there be a camera store? Well, so along the way, I became very close to a family that had a commercial photographic shop, and another man who once lived in Calgary, who was a professional news photographer there. In the room I had in Hamburg, in the Luftwaffe barracks, there were 3 bunks, and eventually Siegel and Sean and I shared that room. And we had it made up quite comfortably with furniture that we took out of other empty rooms, and was very pleasant. But being in Germany was not pleasant for most of the Jewish service people. If the older ones, like Siegel and Sean, who by this time were 30, had strong resentments to all of the things that had happened in the 30s and during the war. And at this point, the camps had all opened out, and the true nature of the total atrocities were appreciated. So older Jewish soldiers really wanted to get home and get out of there. They didn't want any association with those people at all. From my point of view, I understood the economy and the system pretty well, and I enjoyed the best of both worlds. Siegel and Sean found a very large house in a lovely suburb of Hamburg called Blankenese that some British 8th Army Israeli fellows had a home for the orphans of Belsen. And that became Sean and Siegel's favorite time out of barracks. They went over there and helped the people and did what they could and brought them food and so on. And in fact, Siegel's coup of the war was getting all of the mittens, all of the knitted hats, all of the scarves, any kind of clothing that had been in the War Service Fund in our Air Force outfit when we were soon to be going back to Canada, transferred by the chaplain in 3 trucks to those kids. It was a very interesting place, and the tough, hard Israeli operators were the kindest, warmest boys you ever saw. And they had an arrangement where the kids learned some sort of living standards, because some of them had been born, or certainly had spent all of their life in the camps. So they were sort of making them suitable to go out into public, and they were great kids, and there were blondes and blue-eyed and redhead, and the ultimate hope was that these kids would be going by underground railway to Marseille, and from there they would go by boat to Israel. And I believe that happened. Another interesting member of the service people in our camp in Germany was a fellow by the name of Sammy Kirchner. He spoke Yiddish very well because his father was a kosher butcher in Montreal. He managed to get himself in the guardhouse when he was trying to protect somebody from a British MP, and they kept him as long as they could because he was the most important person in the guardhouse, because he could speak to all of the German-speaking employees who came through every day. Once he got out of the guardhouse, he and I got to know each other, and we had many interesting exploits together. And one of them, he suggested to me if I had any food or wine or anything that I could get hold of to bring it, because we were going to a dinner at the home of some Jewish people he'd met. And indeed we did do that, and there were a number of people there. The hostess was a Jewish lady, and they had 2 children, 2 girls about perhaps 7 and 9, and an Aryan father who had slightly reddish hair. And of course I had red hair at the time, so we were joking about that. I wondered, the Jewish kids looked fairly healthy and so on, and I thought, well, somehow they had not gone to the gone into the camps, and it turned out that their German neighbors liked that family so well that they had hidden the 2 children and the mother, and they had never been rounded up and sent to the camps. In the house there was 2 boys, 2 big, tall, probably about my age, I guess, or maybe a year older, Polish lads, and they referred to themselves as brothers. I later learned from Sammy Kirshner, these 2 brothers were 2 last members of their families that had walked out the gates of one of the concentration camps when the Russians came in, walking westward toward Poland, and one said to the other, "Any of your relatives living?" "No, none living. None of mine either. Let's be brothers." That's the kind of funny things that happened in Hamburg during the war. Josh Siegel was a very good friend and quite a competitive photographer. When we had time off in England, we used to go out taking pictures and comparing each other's viewpoints and the prints. And when we got to Germany, we continued a little bit. One of the interesting trips we took, once again, to avoid any direct contact with the German public, was to a Jewish cemetery that he had heard had been desecrated. And as it happened, I remembered seeing it on the bus or something, so I was able to take us there. And it was difficult to find because it was all overgrown. The iron fences had been knocked down and most of the headstones toppled over. As we walked around, it became very noticeable how the Jews had suffered in Europe. The names on the headstones were typically Jose Sebastian Cohen. These were probably Sephardic Jews that had crossed North Africa and gotten into Spain. Then when the Inquisition came in the Middle Ages, they pushed them out of Spain, eastward and northward, and those Jews in this cemetery had found a new home in Germany and had developed large commercial centers and rather famous families. And then the Hitler regime came, and their life in that part of the world ended.
Sky smiling at me, there is nothing but the blue skies that I see, and bluebirds all insist on singing a song, only the bluebirds from now on. I never saw sun shining so bright, and I never saw things going so right. Noticing the days hurrying by, when you're in love, my, how they fly. Blue days are all of them gone. There's just nothing but blue skies from now on. Oh, never saw sun shining so bright, and I never saw the things when they were going so right. noticing the days a hurrying by. When you're in love, my